Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I am very excited to chat all about the publishing world in Jane Austen's time and go through her journey of publishing her works. Jane Austen was writing and had her works published at a very exciting time for the publishing industry. It was right when novels were beginning to gain popularity and establish themselves as a more recognized and respected genre. In 1774, there was a change in copyright law that allowed many existing titles to fall under public domain and encouraged publishers to look for new works to publish. New titles almost doubled from the 1780s to the 1790s, and the time period saw a surge of female writers, even though the idea of a published woman writer at the time was seen to be improper and a violation of modesty. Women, especially women of genteel birth, were discouraged from seeking any type of employment or fame or career that would put them in the public eye, and many who did publish did so anonymously, including Jane Austen herself. Jane wrote her Juvenilia in the time period between 1787 and 1794, and in 1795 she wrote her first version of Sense and Sensibility, which was originally titled Eleanor and Marianne, and was originally written in epistolary form, which is to say it was written as a series of letters back and forth between characters, and that was actually quite common for novels of the time. The following year, in 1796, Jane started writing her second epistolary novel, so another novel in letter form, and that was titled First Impressions. It was the earliest incarnation of what we now know as Pride and Prejudice. A year later, Jane's father wrote a letter to the publisher Thomas Cadell with the finished manuscript of First Impressions. Cadell was Fanny Burney's publisher and also published Anne Radcliffe's The Italian, but refused to consider Jane Austen's First Impressions. In 1798 and 1799, Jane Austen wrote Susan, which was much later published as Northanger Abbey. In 1803, the copyright of Susan was sold for £10 to the publisher Benjamin Crosby, but it was never published. An author in Jane Austen's time had four main ways of getting their works published: subscription, profit sharing, copyright, and commission. Austen published both by copyright and by commission, but mostly by commission. In 1803, she tried to publish Susan by copyright, which means she had someone sell the copyright of her work to a publisher on her behalf for a lump sum of money. The publisher could then publish it as they saw fit and take all of the profits of future publications. Only Crosby never published Susan. And I guess we'll skip ahead a bit because in 1809, Jane tried to get the manuscript back from him in a letter which she signed Mad, Mrs. Ashton Dennis, because she was rather mad about the whole situation. The publisher threatened legal action if she tried to publish the book herself and demanded that she return the £10, which he paid for the manuscript, and which Jane, of course, did not have. In 1816, Jane's brother Henry did buy Susan back for her, and she revised it and changed the name, but it actually wasn't published until after her death as Northanger Abbey. So, going back into our timeline, in 1804, Jane started the Watsons, but never finished it. And in 1805, she finished Lady Susan, which she had begun earlier. Between 1800 and 1810, the publication of new works dropped by 20%. The Napoleonic Wars created an environment of economic uncertainty and interfered with trade routes, which affected the publishing industry since paper was manufactured from imported linen rags. It wasn't until 1811, in her mid-30s, that Jane Austen actually became a published author, and she took a huge financial risk to do so. Austen published Sense and Sensibility on commission with the help of her brother Henry. This meant that Austen had to pay the publisher back for publishing and distribution with income from the book, and the publisher also took an additional commission of 10% from the sales. So if Sense and Sensibility didn't sell well, Austen would have been in serious debt. Luckily for Austen, though, it did do well, and she was able to not only pay her publisher back, but to keep £140 in profits. Austen chose to remain anonymous, and Sense and Sensibility was published by a Lady. Also in 1811, Jane Austen revised First Impressions, turning it into Pride and Prejudice, and the same year she also began Mansfield Park. In 1812, Austen sold the copyright of Pride and Prejudice to the same publisher who published Sense and Sensibility, Thomas Egerton. Based on the success of Sense and Sensibility, he paid her £110. Egerton published 3 editions of Pride and Prejudice starting in 1813 and made considerably more money than Jane did. It was a sad financial decision on Austen's part to sell the copyright of Pride and Prejudice like this. She would have made far more money had she published it by commission, but she sold the copyright before she knew the extent of Sense and Sensibility's success and her profits. Pride and Prejudice also remained anonymous and was advertised as being written by the author of Sense and Sensibility. In 1814, Mansfield Park was published on commission and did extraordinarily well. The first edition sold out, making Jane Austen somewhere between £300 and £340. It brought her more money than anything else she published in her lifetime. Emma was started in 1814 and finished in 1815. It was published on commission in 1816, also anonymously. And Emma included a dedication to the Prince Regent, who was a fan of Austen's even though she disliked him. When Austen visited her brother Henry in London in 1815, the Prince Regent and his librarian learned of her identity and invited her to tour Carlton House, where they subtly, but also not so subtly, asked her to dedicate a book to him. And so, out of a sense of duty and obligation, she did. This time, Austen also switched publishers. It's not entirely clear why Egerton didn't publish Emma, but we do know that Austen submitted the manuscript of Emma to John Murray, who was a more prominent and prestigious publisher. Murray also offered to buy the copyrights for Emma, Sense and Sensibility, and Mansfield Park for £450 total, but Austen declined. In 1816, the second edition of Mansfield Park was also published, but it didn't do as well. The combined sales of Emma and losses of the second edition of Mansfield Park came to a total profit of only about £38 for Austen, which is kind of sad when you think about it, because that's the last revenue she ever saw from her work before her death. In 1816, Austen completed Persuasion, but made no plans to have it published. Some think she was still revising it or planned to revise it further before publication. And in 1817, she began Sanditon, but died before making much progress on it. Jane Austen left her manuscripts and copyrights to her sister Cassandra, who, with Henry's help, published Austen's last 2 novels, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, were published together through John Murray as part of a 4-volume edition. And in this edition, Henry wrote a biographical notice about the author in which he publicly revealed that Jane Austen was the author of all 6 novels. And then Austen's novels stayed out of print for 14 years. At that point, a publisher, Richard Bentley, purchased the copyrights to all of her novels from Cassandra and Henry, and also from Egerton. And in 1833, he issued fresh new editions of all of her novels, making them affordable and hiring an illustrator who depicted all of Austen's characters in contemporary Victorian clothing rather than Regency fashions. These editions were marketed to and appealed to the middle classes, but sales were average and she was still relatively unknown as an author. Interest in Austen was renewed in 1869 with the publication of James Edward Austen Leigh's A Memoir of Jane Austen. Austen's nephew wrote this biography that portrayed Jane as a quiet, middle-aged, non-prepossessing woman whose work was moral and suitable for the Victorians. I find it so interesting how Austen's legacy has been shaped by the Victorians, how this public image of her as some model Victorian woman was cultivated, how aspects of domesticity in her works were emphasized while downplaying her social criticism and downplaying the events during her lifetime that clearly shape and inform her works. And it's so interesting how more recent scholarship on Austen oftentimes tries to peel back this veneer that the Victorians have placed over Austen's life and work. I find so much about Austen's publication history fascinating. It was rocky at times, and her works went through so many different revisions and variations. Is Persuasion as we know it today what Jane Austen would have published? Or would it have been different if she had had more time to think about it and revise it? If she was still relatively unknown as an author until after James Austen Edward Lee's memoir, to what extent did she influence other authors, specifically Victorian authors? Charlotte Bronte read Austen and was famously critical of her works, but did many other Victorian authors read her books? This would obviously require more research on my part and could probably be an entirely different video, but if you know more about it, please do let me know in the comments. I always wonder what would have happened if Jane had lived into the Victorian era, when the novel truly exploded as an art form. How would she have handled serialization, and how would that have affected her work? How would her work generally have evolved? Would she have gained more popularity in her lifetime? Would she have remained anonymous during her lifetime? Before I start rambling, since I could talk about Jane Austen for quite a while, it was fun to look at Austen's path to publication and a tiny bit of what publishing was like in her time. I knew random tidbits of information, but to see it put together in a timeline like this has been really interesting and really helpful for me, and I hope it was for you too. It's definitely just an overview. I know I didn't chat too much about how Jane Austen fits in with the Gothic novel, which was popular at the time she was writing, or focus on her readership and critical reviews of her novels as they were released, like how the public thought about them. But I'd be curious to know how learning a little bit about Austen's path to publication informs how you view her work, and just generally what thoughts all of this brings up for you. So until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another bookish video very soon. Bye!